Hey, my friend, Dr. Lee Warren, back for some more self-brain surgery. I'm so grateful to have you back on the podcast, and I am really excited about today's special guest. We had Lee Strobel on the show a couple of years ago to talk about his amazing book, Is God Real?, which was one of my top 5 books of 2023. And that book, if you haven't read it, just fantastic look at the evidence for whether or not God's real. Well, Lee Strobel is a former atheist and ultimately using his investigative journalism skills led himself to the undeniable truth that Jesus and faith in God are real. So he's an atheist turned Christian. Lee Strobel, the former award-winning legal editor of the Chicago Tribune, is back with us today for another amazing talk. He is a multiple New York Times bestselling author of more than 40 books and curricula. He's sold over 15 million copies of these things in total. And his brand new book just hit the market last week. It is an instant New York Times bestseller. You'll hear him talk about that briefly in a moment. The new book is called Seeing the Supernatural. And this conversation we're going to have today with Lee Strobel gets into these questions like, how do we know whether or not there's a realm beyond what we can see and touch? We talked to Lee Strobel about that because of his new book, in which he did lots of interviews like he always does. He's a journalist, so he goes and finds experts all over the world to talk about the things that he's interested in for this book. And this book is the eye-opening investigation of angels, demons, mystical dreams, near-death encounters, and other mysteries of the unseen world. Seeing the Supernatural, his new book, the subtitle is Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen. This episode is about exploring the questions that science can't answer. Look, we hear stories all the time about the supernatural, miraculous healings, unexplained sightings like ghosts and near-death experiences, but how do we know what's real? Are rumors of these spiritual beings, healings, prophetic dreams, dangerous deceptions, or are they just rumors, or is there something important there for us to explore? And whether you're a Christian or not, these are questions that lots of people in society want to know answers to. Everybody's fascinated with the occult, about what happens after death, about whether God is real. And Lee's book is going to help us discover solid answers to these provocative questions you've been asking about the supernatural world. Again, healings, angels, demons, mystical dreams, all this stuff. Is heaven real? Is hell real? He's going to do it through the investigative, journalistic lens of a former spiritual skeptic. You know Lee Strobel probably best for his book, The Case for Christ. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the previous episode where he was with us before for Is God Real? That was one of my favorite all-time podcast episodes and one of my favorite all-time books. I've referred tons of people to that book. And I think it's fascinating and it's important. If you're not sure what you believe, if you want to look at evidence for whether or not God is real, probably the most important question any of us can ask in our lives, right? Is God real? Then that book will be really helpful. But Seeing the Supernatural, this book is special. It's fascinating. It's well written as always. And I think it'll help you better understand how God chooses to work in the fascinating supernatural realm and why it's important to avoid common mistakes that people make, including ignoring the supernatural or becoming overly obsessed with it. Lee helps us thread the needle to have answers ready when you face objections or deceptions that are common in a world of supernatural counterfeits. We want to draw closer to God as you catch glimpses of his power and glory in ways that you don't typically experience. New York Times bestselling writer, investigative journalist, one of my favorite authors, Lee Strobel. Welcome back, Lee.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
You've got a brand new book out, and it is debuting this week on the New York Times bestseller list at number 8.
Yeah.
Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Seeing the
Thank you. I'm thrilled
Supernatural.
with that. Thank you.
It's not the first time you've been on that list, but it's amazing that it's there on the first week it's out. Huh?
Yeah, it's very satisfying and fulfilling. More important to me are people like you and other knowledgeable people who've read the book and say, yeah, this makes sense. It does point toward a realm beyond what we can see and touch. And to have philosophers and scientists and experts say that it's a faithful rendition of the evidence for a supernatural realm, that to me, that's the most satisfying.
Absolutely. And you did that. I mean, I think you did it beautifully. Like you always do. You took an investigative approach to these big questions of what's out there beyond what we can see and touch and feel. And maybe just for a second, if for somebody that hasn't read the book yet, give a little overview of this
Yeah.
project and then we'll get into specifics.
Yeah, we live in a 21st century realm where we want to know, can I see it? Can I touch it? Can I put it in a test tube? And the question I asked is the Bible telling us the truth when it talks about a realm beyond that which we can see and touch? And I think the evidence is powerful and persuasive that yes, there is. I look at everything from a fascinating topic, which is deathbed visions that people have just before they die, just as Stephen did in the Bible in Acts. Near-death experiences. I know you've had John Burke on your program, and I interview him in my book about the near-death experience situation. The question of whether or not we are just a brain, or do we have a soul? Do we have a spirit? Do we have a consciousness that's beyond just our physical brain? I look at supernatural dreams that are occurring among Muslims in countries where it's difficult or illegal even to share the gospel. Those are fascinating. And the resurrection, I look at that. We got Easter coming up, and that's always an important topic to deal with as well. So I think there's a wide range of topics that point toward the fact that there is something beyond what our physical world suggests that there is.
That's right. And you start really by the big question. Like you talked to Sharon Dirks, who the listeners of the show will know very well, a PhD scientist from Oxford. Am I just my brain? I mean, we talk about that on this show all the time. I think Christians, at least intellectually, Christians believe that something about us lives after we die, which means you can't be your brains. I mean, unpack that idea for just a second.
Yeah, it's exactly true. In fact, I was thinking I should have interviewed you for this chapter. You got all the credentials and knowledge in this area. I could have just gone up to Nebraska and spent the day with you. It would have been great. Next book.
Next time.
But Sharon Dirks is great. She's awesome. PhD in neuroscience. Her point is that we are more than a physical brain, that there is a spirit, a consciousness that can continue to live on after our physical body dies. And she said, interestingly, all we really need is one clear-cut case of a near-death experience where a person is clinically dead, and yet their spirit, their soul, their consciousness is surviving to prove that we're not just our brains. And she used a wonderful analogy. She said, imagine if there's a woman named Mary, she's a scientist, and she's a world's leading expert on the human eye. And she understands everything about the science of sight and the retina and how the brain processes the information that comes from the eye and all the chemistry involved and so forth. And she knows it all, but she's blind. And she said, what if all of a sudden one day she was given the ability to see? Would she learn anything new? And you go, yes, of course she would. Why? Because the brain is not, or consciousness is not reducible just to our brain. That
Right.
There's a first-person perspective that is attributable to a spirit, a soul, a consciousness that is separate from but interacts with our physical brain.
That's right. So what led you to investigate this, to all the things you've looked at? Christianity, does it stand up to journalistic rigor? Like all the things, is God real? All these things that you've done. Why supernatural stuff at this time in history? Why is that so important right now?
Because I've seen a proliferation of some popular media dealing with the supernatural in recent years, television shows, movies, and so forth. We seem to be captivated by this question of the supernatural. And I thought, the problem is so many people delve into the occult. They delve into things that are not well supported by evidence. And I thought, if I can use this as a bridge to help people understand the biblical perspective of this unseen realm, then maybe some would find faith in Jesus as a result. That's my personal goal, is to drag as many people to heaven with me as I can. So
That's right.
I want to use this as a way to connect with people who have curiosity about the supernatural realm, but are unsure of what they can really put their trust in. And that was my main motivation. I hope it gives them a sense of conviction and a stronger sense of confidence that indeed there is more to our world than what we see and touch.
I love that. And I want to go a little further into that in a moment. I want to make sure we touch on this because there's a lot of people that listen to this show that are in that category of wanting to know about science and how the brain works and neuroscience. But then they start to realize that science really can't answer every question. Like even following a rigorous scientific method, you still find some things that can't be answered by science. So maybe one of the things that we see in culture is this insistence that everything can be reduced to science. Address that for just a second for that listener that may think that. Like, what's the difference between science and scientism and these big questions like that?
Yeah, the statement that the only thing that is, let's put it this way. If you were to have a simple statement that says science is the only arbiter of truth, that is self-refuting because that statement itself is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement.
It can't
And
be
so
tested
to
by the
say that,
scientific method. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Exactly. So the idea that we can reduce everything just to science doesn't make sense. It's self-refuting. We have to look at philosophy. We have to look at history. We have to look at other ways in which we can deduce reliable evidence to try to determine is something true or false. And science is an important way to do that. It's a very effective way in many realms, but it's not the only way.
that's
So we can go beyond that and say, it's sort of like saying every sentence in the English language has 5 words in it. Wait a minute, that's self-refuting. It contradicts itself. Well, to say science is the only arbiter of truth, self-contradicts, it's self-contradicting. So,
right.
yes, science is important, but it's not the only thing that's important in trying to delve into reality.
That's right. So you have this culture that says sort of science is everything, and then you have a society that, with this cognitive dissonance of recognizing that it can't be everything, starts to look at the occult or looks into supernatural
Yes.
experiences, and there's this chasm in between. And I think maybe that's an opportunity for us to speak. Like, what does the Bible have to say about all this stuff,
Yes.
supernatural, afterlife, death, hell,
Yeah,
big questions like that?
exactly. The Bible presupposes the existence of the soul. It never has a verse that says, this is what the soul is, or this is why you should believe that we have a soul.
That's
It
right.
presupposes, it just talks about the soul and civilizations going down through history. Virtually all of them believed in a spirit, a soul that was separate from our physical body. So this is not a revolutionary claim.
That's right.
But in modern times, it has become a revolutionary claim. Many people reject it outright without, I don't think, giving it due consideration.
That's right. So what do you think a reasonable person who holds to the Christian faith would say about supernatural visions? These Muslim encounters especially are fascinating to me. Like, what does the Bible say about dreams and visions and those kinds of things? And then what did you find when you actually investigated that claim?
The dreams and visions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. There are about 200 examples in Scripture of God using dreams and visions. So certainly we have documentation in the Old and the New Testament that God has used that approach in the past. Well,
That's
what's
right.
fascinating is we have seen more Muslims become Christians in the last couple of decades than we've seen in the previous 1,400 years since Muhammad. And a third to a quarter of them, this is preceded by a supernatural dream or vision of Jesus. And this is what gets me. It's corroborated. It's not just a Muslim goes to sleep in Saudi Arabia, has a dream about Jesus, wakes up as a Christian. That's not how it works. Because then you could say, well, maybe it's just a psychological manifestation of something. Maybe they had a bad pizza that night or whatever. There's external corroboration. And let me give you a couple examples. There's a woman named Noor in Cairo. She was a Muslim mother of 8, and she had a dream about Jesus. It was like no dream she'd ever had in her life. And Jesus is walking with her along a lake, and she just feels the love and the grace and the beauty and the joy of Jesus as she's walking with him. And she said, I'm in the presence of a man, and I don't feel shame for the first time in my life. She's just overwhelmed by him. And she says, Jesus, why do you appear to me? I'm just a poor mother of 8. And he said, my friend will tell you tomorrow. And she said, well, who's your friend? And he gestures down, and she didn't realize because she'd been so mesmerized by Jesus that there was a man also walking with her. And then she wakes up. Next day, she goes to the crowded marketplace in Cairo, and she sees the man from her dream. She goes up. She says, you're the one. You're the one. He said, whoa, what are you talking about? He said, same eyes, same glasses, same face, same clothes. You're the one. And he said, did you have a dream about Jesus last night? And she said, yes. Well, it turned out he was an underground church planter. And he didn't want to go to the crowded marketplace on Friday afternoon in Cairo because it's chaotic. But he felt 100% convinced that God had an assignment for him. So he went that day. He meets Noor. He pulls her aside. He opens the Bible, and he shares the gospel. That's how these things work. I'll give you another example. It's a man, I'll use the name of Omar. Omar is raised in a refugee camp, Palestinian. He grows up hating Jewish people. His goal in life is to kill as many Jewish people as he possibly can. And so he's walking down the road headed toward Hamas. He wants to join Hamas, a terrorist organization. And as he's walking down the road, all of a sudden his path is blocked by this man in white. And this man looks at him and he says, Omar, this is not the plan I have for your life. This is the wrong path. I want you to turn around and I want you to go home. And he's shocked by this. So he turns around, he goes home. Well, later that day, Christian man began moving into the apartment across the hall from him. And he's moving in his furniture, and Omar meets him and tells him about this vision. And he says, what do you think it means? And the man says, well, here's what I think it means. And he opens the Bible and he shares the gospel with him. Omar comes to faith in Christ. And today he's a church planter underground in the Middle East. Wow. So this is the external corroboration that I look for as a journalist and as someone trained in law. I want to see something that tells me it's beyond just something in our brain. And by the way, no devout Muslim in the Middle East has any incentive to go to sleep and have a dream about the Jesus of Christianity.
That's right.
Because there's the possibility they may be converted, fall into apostasy, and maybe in some places face a death sentence. So they have no innate motivation to have a dream like this anyway. But I love the way God provides these external corroborations for this. I mean, that to me is the clincher.
That's right. I remember one of the early J.D. Greer books. And J.D. was a missionary in a Muslim country, and people knocked on his door and said, and it was secret, you couldn't be openly a Christian missionary. And people would knock on his door and say, I had a dream last night that the man told me to come to this house and ask you to tell us about Jesus or tell us about the truth. And it happened over and over, like in a way that he couldn't deny.
Yes. That's, in fact, in Cairo, often there's an ad in the newspaper, and the ad says, call this number, and we'll tell you about the man in white you met in your dream last night.
Wow.
And people just keep calling this number.
In Western evangelicalism, I think so many of us have bought into the idea of, I think they call it cessationism.
Yeah, cessationism.
Dreams and gifts stopped at Pentecost or whatever, and that stuff doesn't happen anymore, but it does happen. It happens over and over and over, especially in the undeveloped world.
It really does. And there's two kinds of cessationists. One kind says that the gifts of healing, the miraculous gifts, no longer apply. Another kind says, no, miracles continue, and they would say miracles continue to exist. They're just saying that the gift of healing and the gift of the miraculous no longer applies, but there's still miracles that God does. And then there's other cessationists who say, no, there's no miracles anymore, and there is no gift of healing or miraculous. So there's kind of two camps. I think most cessationists would fall in the camp of saying, I don't believe the gifts of healing continue, but I still believe God can do miracles today. I think that's probably the most populated camp of cessationists.
Right. So after investigating this as a journalist, what do you say about healing? I mean, in that context, what do you say about healing in the 21st century?
I looked at cases that are published in medical journals. I looked at scientific research in the area of healings, and there is a lot out there. I'll give you an example. There's a woman who was blind from an incurable condition, juvenile macular degeneration. She was blind for 12 years. She learned how to read Braille. She went to a school for the blind. She walked with a white cane, and she married a Baptist pastor. And one night, they're getting ready for bed, and she's in bed, and he comes over, and he puts his hand on her shoulder, and he begins to cry, and he begins to pray, and he says, Lord, I know you can heal my wife. I know you can do it. And Lord, I pray you do it tonight. And she opened her eyes to perfect vision. And she's been able to see now it's been 47 years since that happened. This is research by multiple medical researchers published in a peer-reviewed medical publication. And with all the records and so forth. And this, to me, is what I'm looking for. There was another case of a baby who was born and just kept vomiting, couldn't keep down food. And they diagnosed that child with an incurable condition called, you'll probably know what it's called, gastroparesis, which is a paralysis of the stomach. And so they had to do surgery. They had to put in tubes so that the food would go directly into the small intestine. And so this was a problem with the child growing up, but he lived, and but it was a hassle, it was a struggle. When he was a teenager, 16 years old, his parents brought him to a church, and the pastor got up and talked about how he had been healed supernaturally. And so they went up afterwards, said, "Would you pray for our son?" So the pastor put his hand on his shoulder, and the boy said later, I felt like an electric shock went through me. And he was instantly healed of this supposedly incurable condition. He's now lived for many years afterward. He's normal digestion. They went in, they removed the tubes in him for the digestion and so forth. And his life has really turned around for him. Thank God. But what do you do with that? What do you do with those kind of things? And then there's the case of the professor from Indiana University with a PhD from Harvard who heard about an outbreak of the miraculous in Mozambique. And she said, I'm going to test it. So she sent a team of researchers. They go over, they say, bring us all your blind and deaf. They test them scientifically to determine what is their level of hearing and seeing. Then they're prayed for, and then they're tested immediately again. And virtually all of them had improvement. In fact, get this, the average improvement in visual acuity was tenfold. There's a woman named Martine, when they first met her, could not hear a jackhammer next to her. After 10 minutes of prayer in the name of Jesus, she could hear normal conversations. So they went to Brazil, another place where the gospel is breaking in. That's where miracles tend to cluster. They did the same test. They got the same results. So this was accepted for publication in a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, the Southern Medical Journal, a well-respected publication. It is a valid, scientific, rigorous study. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that? I think that the evidence, when I see cases like this where you have multiple eyewitnesses with no motive to deceive, when you've got backup corroborative evidence from before and after, when you've got a spirit or an atmosphere of prayer and so forth, I got to say it's a miracle. I'm sorry. That's the most natural, logical explanation I think you can come up with.
That's right. I had a personal testimony as a doctor. So I had a patient that had a stroke in the brainstem, the medulla, right in the center of the area that controls what we call automatic breathing. So this ability that we have to breathe while we're asleep, where we don't have to think about it. And those people, the condition's called Ondine's curse. And basically, if they're not awake, they quit breathing and they die. So you have to put them on a ventilator. They have to be on a ventilator all the time. And this
My
woman had
goodness.
been on a ventilator 7 or 8 days, and we had an MRI to show the stroke, and it's not going to get better. It just doesn't get better. And so I had a conversation with her husband, and I said, okay, tomorrow, like the tube's been in too long. We need to do a tracheostomy, or we have to take her off the ventilator and let her die because she's going to eroding her esophagus and trachea, and you can't keep a tube in for too long. It causes trouble. And he was like, no, she's not going to get a trach. I prayed for her, and tomorrow she's going to be okay. Like it's going to be okay. So I was like, okay, well, we'll talk again tomorrow. So I came in the next day. The woman seriously is sitting up out of the bed in the ICU, extubated, reading the newspaper, and she's breathing on her own. And she slept all night breathing on her own after they extubated her. And we did another MRI. The stroke is still there. Like the part of the brainstem that controls respiration is gone. Prayer healed her. It's like, so in my experience, that's a miracle because I know the
Yeah.
anatomy of what had to happen for her to breathe. So I believe it myself.
Yeah. I mean, you would have to have a preconceived conviction that miracles are impossible to deny that. I mean, if you follow the evidence, I think it points in that direction clearly. I mean, we have a case I mentioned in my book of a little girl who had a virus, lost her hearing. It was incurable, but she had hearing aids because she had some hearing, but she hated those hearing aids. And her parents and her were praying for her healing. And she went to school one day, and the hearing aids were damaged. So she goes to the audiologist. She gets tested again. She gets the hearing aids put back in. That night, she comes down the stairs. She said, Mommy, I can hear without the hearing aids. And her mother couldn't believe it. She calls the audiologist. She said, that's impossible, but bring her in. So they bring her in, and her hearing is normal. Now, here we have a case where we have a test of her before the miracle and immediately after the miracle with 100% healing.
That's right.
What changed except people were praying for her?
That's right. And that's exactly what the Bible tells us to do, right? James 5:16, like effective prayer of a righteous person avails much. That's what we're supposed to do. But we let society convince us that science can tell us things that the Bible disagree with the Bible, and we believe it. So I think that's a faith issue.
I'm curious. I know you deal with a lot of really serious cases of health issues with neurosurgery that you do and so forth. Have you ever run into a case where someone on their deathbed has had a supernatural vision?
I have. I've had people that had what we call, deathbed conversions, where they've never believed their whole life, and then something happened, and they saw a vision, and they felt like they knew what was true all of a sudden, and they.
Yes.
I've always had, am I Are they just not wanting to die without believing in something, or is something miraculous happening? I've had a number of people say that their loved one said something to them the day before, that they'd had a dream or had had a really strong feeling that God was telling them that he was real. And I've seen that a
Yes.
number of times.
It's it's fascinating how
It is.
common these are. They went to a large hospice facility in New York State because a lot of people who are in that condition, they're kind of embarrassed to talk about it because they don't want you to think I've got dementia or whatever. So they don't say anything. But they went to a huge hospice facility in New York State and told all the dying folks there, if you have a vision or a vivid dream, unlike anything you've ever had, would you tell us? We really would like to know. And they found that 88% of them had a pre-death vision.
Wow.
I mean, these have been tens of thousands of these have been studied. And one team studied 3,000 cases of them, and their conclusion was these are definitely not hallucinations, fantasies, or memories caused by grief, nor are they projections of the subconscious mind or products of an overactive imagination. These pre-death visions are, and often we have corroboration. In fact, I'm telling my wife about this. I do this research, I get all hyped up, and I tell her, hey, honey, guess what I found out? She said, Lee, don't you remember what happened to my dad 25 years ago? I said, oh my gosh, I forgot. Her dad was dying, and on his deathbed, Leslie comes to the hospice to visit him. And she comes in, and he's all agitated. And he keeps saying, where's Marge? Where's Marge? Where's Marge? I was just talking to Marge. She was just here. Where's Marge? Well, Marge was his sister. She had died 3 days earlier, but nobody told him because he was so sick. They didn't want it to kill him when he found his sister had died. So nobody told him that Marge had died. But here he is having a conversation with Marge on his deathbed.
Wow.
What do you do with that? And that's so common. There's a case in England where one of the most prominent Irish scholars, physicians, and scientists, his wife was a medical doctor, and they were treating a woman named Doris who was dying. And on her deathbed, Doris sees otherworldly beings. She sees angelic beings, and she sees her father who died several years earlier, and he's kind of beckoning her and welcoming her. And then she gets all puzzled, and she said, wait a minute. Why is Vida with him? What? It doesn't make sense. Why would Vida be there? And then she died. Well, Vida was her sister, and she had died a couple of weeks earlier, but no one had told her because she was so sick. Nobody wanted to kill her by telling her the bad news. And yet she saw Vida in the world to come, not knowing that she had already passed.
Wow.
And one of the other things that's fascinating is in the Bible where Jesus tells the story about Lazarus, this beggar, and a rich man who both died. And the rich man goes to a place of torment, but Lazarus, the beggar, goes to a place of bliss. And Jesus says, I think it's Luke 16:22, Jesus says, angels carried Lazarus to the bosom of Abraham. And so often, people who are dying see angels coming for them. Children who are dying see angels coming for them. And what's particularly interesting is children who see angels before they die do not see angels like you would expect them to be seen. In other words, for a child, for a 5-year-old child, 4-year-old child, an angel is a cartoon character. And they have big wings. They all have big wings. And that's not what they see. So you would think if this was just a product of their imagination, they would see the caricature of the big-winged angels. But we have a PhD study by a woman who got her doctorate studying these kind of pre-death visions. And it was a case of a little girl who was dying. And she said, Mommy, can you see them? The angels, they're coming for me. Oh, they're so beautiful. Look at their eyes. Listen to their singing. Oh, they're so wonderful. And her mother didn't want to disappoint her, so she lied. And she said, oh yeah, I see the angels. Look at their big wings. And the little girl said, oh, Mommy, you don't have to lie. They don't have big wings. And she went on to describe them in vivid detail. And then she died. I think that's fascinating. In fact, one last story about that. Charles Templeton, who was Billy Graham's best friend, who was his pulpit partner, and people thought he would become the great evangelist, who lost his faith and became an agnostic, if not an atheist, wrote an ugly book called Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith. He was Canadian. And I interviewed him for my book, The Case for Faith, and wrote the rest of the book responding to his objections. But anyway, he ended up coming back to faith in Christ before he died. A lot of people don't know that. But he's on his deathbed, and he's calls out to his wife, Madeline, can you see them? She said, what? Chuck, what are you talking about? The angels, they're here. They're coming for me. Oh my goodness, they're in the room. They're filling the room. Look at their eyes. They're so beautiful. Their singing is so beautiful. I'm going to go with God, be with God. I'm leaving. I'm going to be with him shortly before he died. And you go, that is so common among people who are dying.
Wow. I remember John Burke talking about in his book, Imagine the God of Heaven, he talked about the people that have these visions and dreams. Often the reason that their stories are so credible is because telling those stories is threatening to them in some way, status quo
Yes.
or life or death sometimes. So
Yes.
I have a strong sense that it's reasonable for the listener to believe that these things are true. And what do you think the purpose of them is? If God's really
Yeah.
doing this, why would he do this?
Yeah, I think, first of all, what you said is exactly right, that there's special credibility to the statement of a dying person. In fact, I'm trained in law, and if you go to the federal rules of evidence, what you find is a declaration by a dying person is given extra weight in criminal and civil trials because the law says someone on the verge of dying who knows they're dying is not going to make up a lie. They have
Yeah.
nothing to gain. So most likely it's a exception to the hearsay rule in federal rules of procedure,
Right.
which is really, when you think about it, why would a person who's about to die make up something or invent something? So I think that's extra credibility that this is true. And I think, you look in the book of Acts and you see the story of Stephen, who's going to be stoned to death. He's about to be stoned to death for his faith. And he has this pre-death vision, and he looks up and he sees the heavens opening up, and he sees the Son and the Father together. And I think it was a way of confirming to him and affirming to him that Jesus is who he claimed to be, that here he is with the Father, and a way of almost welcoming him to the next realm. And I think it may be something like that.
Well, I don't want to take the conversation into too much of a dark corner here, but I think it needs to be talked about. Like, we have in society, so many nowadays have diminished the role of hell. Is there even a literal hell? A lot of people think diminish the demonic and the existence of those
Yes.
things, and everything's about grace and about, your past going to lead you to truth and all that. So what does the evidence say about demonic experiences,
Yeah.
about the existence of a literal devil, a literal hell? Like,
Yeah.
into that question.
Well, you're right that the Bible is explicit about this, and we do see good evidence of the demonic activity in our world today. There's a kind of a chilling story I tell in the book about a highly respected psychiatrist. So he's a medical doctor trained in psychiatry at Ivy League University. He's a professor part-time at two very elite institutions in the Northeast. I have a quote from the former president of the American Psychiatric Association saying this is a man of great integrity, great learning, great credibility. And about 20 years ago, he and his wife had two cats. And the cats loved each other. They slept together. They were best friends. Until one night, the cats attacked each other viciously. They're screeching at each other. They're clawing at each other. They're trying to tear each other apart. It's this wild scene of them attacking each other. And they pull them apart and put them in separate rooms. And they're thinking, what was that all about? Well, the next day at 9 a.m., the doorbell rings. It was a previous appointment where a Catholic priest was bringing to him a woman to be examined psychiatrically, a woman who claimed that she was a high priestess of a satanic cult.
Wow.
And they wanted to know, is she demon possessed or is she psychologically confused or whatever? The doorbell rings. He opens the door, and here's this woman who claims to be the high priestess of a satanic cult. And she looks up at him and she smirks. And she says, how'd you like those cats last night?
Wow.
Yeah. And you go, okay. I mean, if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, it did mine.
It does.
But he ended up spending 20 years investigating demonic possessions. And he's witnessed them. He's very involved with Catholic priests who perform exorcisms. And he's written an entire book on that topic. And he describes cases where he has firsthand knowledge of people who don't know Latin, and yet they're speaking in Latin. He has one case with, I think it was 6 or 8 people who witnessed someone levitating off a bed. One case where a petite woman who's like 120 pounds picked up and threw a 300-pound Lutheran deacon across the room with a supernatural kind of strength. I mean, there are things that, in his professional opinion, as a highly respected psychiatrist, that this is not a psychiatric condition. there is something else going on here, and he believes it is demonic. Now, the good news for Christians is that Christians cannot be demonically possessed
That's right.
because we're indwelled by the Holy Spirit. And we can't be simultaneously indwelled by the Holy Spirit and indwelled by a demon. But they can hector us. They can bug us. They can bother us. And they can plot against us. And they can try to thwart us. And that's why spiritual warfare is important. Ephesians talks about putting on the full armor of God to be prepared
Yeah.
to study Scripture so we can know what is real and what isn't, what is true and what isn't. But it's a very real phenomenon. But you know what? So are angels. What are
That's right.
demons but fallen angels? And I was really encouraged by the interview I did with a scholar on the topic of angels. Because, I think a lot of Christians, the Bible talks about angels, so I believe in angels, but deep down, I'm not so sure. Come
Right.
on. I mean, that's kind of weird, isn't it? But the stories of angelic intersections with human lives are compelling. There's a case of a guy named John G. Paton, Paton. He and his wife were missionaries in the New Hebrides Islands in the South Pacific, and they lived in a little cottage, and they were sharing Jesus on this island. Well, the local tribes people didn't like that, and one night a mob came to kill them, burn down their house and kill them. So here they are huddling in their house. They're praying, God, help us. I don't know what to do. This mob is gathering outside. They're going to burn down our house. They're going to kill us. And they just prayed for God's protection. Well, by dawn, praying all night, the mob dissipated. Never heard of. Well, a year later, the leader of that mob became a Christian. And this missionary was having a conversation with him. He said, hey, do you remember that night when you led a mob to come burn down our house and kill him? Why didn't you do it? And he said, oh, well, who are all those men that you had protecting your house? He said,
Wow.
there were no men. It was just my wife and I. No. Your house was surrounded by these burly men in white garments with drawn swords. There was no way we could burn down your house that night.
Wow.
What could that be, I think, other than angels?
That's angels. Wow.
And it's interesting that, the Bible says, don't pray to angels, because John in Revelation, at one point, he meets an angel, and he's so overwhelmed by the beauty of the angel, he falls down to worship him. And the angel says, hey, don't worship me, only worship God.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's a danger in praying to angels, I think, because it could morph into worship. But to pray to God about angels, I think I didn't used to do that, but I do it now. Martin Luther, in this small catechism, one of his evening prayers is, God, send your holy angels to protect me from the evil one. And so Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he's being arrested, he says, do you not think that I could pray right now and my Father would send legions of angels to protect me? Of course he would, if I asked him to. And so Jesus talking about going to the Father and asking for angelic protection. So I do that now. I didn't used to. But I pray that God would send angels to protect me and the family and the grandchildren and so forth.
That's biblical. Yeah.
It is biblical. Yeah. But, there's an embarrassment too. I got to tell you,
Oh.
I personally had an encounter with an angel when I was 12 years old. And I never used to tell people because I thought they'll think I'm nuts. And the one time I told people was at my ordination many, many decades ago, when all these theologians were questioning me about my doctrine to make sure I was orthodox and everything.
Yeah.
And I thought, do I tell them about this encounter I had with an angel? I think I'm nuts. No, I'm going to tell them. So I told them. And their response was, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's okay. Fine. And what it was, I'm 12 years old in the kitchen of my house, in this vivid dream, the only dream I remember from my childhood, this angel appeared to me. And he began extolling heaven, how beautiful and wonderful heaven is. And I listened for a moment and I said, well, I'm going to go there someday. And he looked at me and he said, how do you know? What do you mean, how do I know? I'm a good kid. I obey my parents mostly. I get good grades at school. I'm nice to my friends. I'm trying to justify my goodness to earn my way to heaven. And the angel said, that doesn't matter. And a chill went down my spine. He's like, how could that, I'm stammering. How could that not matter? What are you talking about? And he said, someday you'll understand. And he disappeared.
Wow.
About, 16 years later, I'm an atheist. I suppressed that. I thought it was a bad pizza and didn't really happen. And walked the other way from God, became an atheist, but then my wife dragged me to church on January the 20th of 1980. And I heard the gospel for the first time that I understood it. And my first thought was, the angel was right. He told me something that day when I was a kid that I did not know. That is, salvation is by grace, not by good works. He told me
That's right.
something I didn't know. And secondly, he made a prophecy that someday I would understand that came true about 16 years later. So to
Wow.
me, that's corroboration that I really did have this encounter with an angelic being.
That's fascinating. And what's interesting is he was planting a seed in your life
Yes,
that would be important to you when you had that conversion moment. Like, that's
that's
right.
right. It was like an affirmation that when I heard the gospel for the first time, I was like, oh, yeah, wait a minute. That's what that angel told me when I was a kid.
Wow.
And you're right. It was almost like an amplification that this
Yeah.
is,
God's faithful like that. Let's talk about ghosts for a minute. Like you had some stories, supernatural encounters that seem like ghosts.
yeah.
What would you learn?
Yeah, here's my problem with the idea of ghosts. A technical definition of a ghost is someone who dies, but they refuse to enter into the afterlife. I don't see that in the Bible. I don't see a biblical example of that. And so I tend to be very skeptical about claims that there are ghostly apparitions that are something from the world beyond. Personal
Right.
opinion, I think a lot of that is demonic. I
Yep.
think a lot of that is, the Bible says that Satan can appear as an angel of light. And I believe Satan wants to deceive us. And I think that demons can try to fool us and to scare us and to take us down a path toward the occult. And so I just don't see a lot of biblical evidence that, there's a couple of references to ghosts in the Bible, but it's more of a reference like, well, see me, I have flesh and blood. I'm not like a ghost. He's not affirming that
Right.
ghosts
Right.
exist. He's just saying, everybody knows what a ghost is, right? Well, I'm obviously not a
Right.
ghost. So I'm skeptical about ghosts, and I'm skeptical even more about psychics. And I interviewed an expert on psychics and ghosts who really has a lot of cautions about this. And he talks about how psychics fool people into thinking they know more than they really do. There's 3 levels. There's cold readings, there's warm readings, and hot readings, different ways that psychics kind of glean information from you and try to make you think they know more than they really do. Because the Bible in Deuteronomy and Leviticus specifically says, don't be consulting mediums.
That's right.
Don't be going to channelers and folks like that. This is demonic. And so I think with the biblical admonition against that and all the evidence, the way that many of them manipulate you to think they know more than they do, it's better not to go down that pathway.
That's
Better
right.
not to get involved with the occult in that way.
That's right. One thing that stands out to you after all this research and all the work that you did investigating the supernatural, what's the story that like keeps you up at night a little bit?
You know what it is? This may sound odd, but to me, it's Jesus Christ returning from the dead. It's the resurrection. I keep going back to that. That haunts me. In fact, I just saw something written by a famous atheist recently, and I haven't read the article yet, but the headline was that he's haunted by the evidence for the resurrection, as I was when
Wow.
I was a skeptic. I keep going back to that, and it's Easter season coming up, and I have a chapter in my book where I interview an expert on the resurrection, and I just keep going back to the fact that the evidence that Jesus didn't just claim to be the Son of God, but backed up that claim by returning from the dead is so powerful and so persuasive that I don't see an alternative explanation that it can explain it away. In fact, when I was a student at Yale Law School, one of my heroes was the greatest defense attorney on the planet. He ended up in the Guinness Book of World Records. He won 245 murder trials in a row as a defense attorney, either before the jury or on appeal. He's the greatest defense attorney in the world. Queen Elizabeth knighted him twice, and
Wow.
he became a member of the Supreme Court of his country. And he, like me at the time, was a skeptic about the resurrection of Jesus until someone challenged him and said, Sir Lionel, you're the greatest lawyer in the world. Have you ever taken your monumental legal skill and applied it to the historical record about the resurrection and come to an informed verdict about whether he rose from the dead? He said, no, I haven't, but I will. He ended up doing what I ended up doing and many others have done, spent years investigating the evidence. And I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that summarized his conclusion. He said, I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt.
Wow.
This from the most successful defense attorney in the world. And by the way, I told that story at Saddleback Church in California after I moved there in the year 2000 to be a pastor. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "Hey, I'm your new neighbor. You're moving into our neighborhood. We haven't met yet. I live a couple of houses down." I said, "Oh, that's great." She said, No, you need to understand something. I'm Sir Lionel's sister."
Wow.
It was the sister of Sir Lionel Luckhoo, the greatest defense attorney in the world, and she lived a couple houses away from me. Not only did she confirm the story, she actually showed me some of his personal records that he kept during his investigation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And by the way, he ended up leaving the legal profession and becoming an evangelist because he wanted to drag as many people to heaven with him as he possibly could.
Which is your stated mission too. That's amazing.
That's right.
So-
That's right. We have that in common.
As we get ready to land this plane, Lee, what do you hope the reader takes away from this new book of yours? What do you hope they walk away with?
I hope that a person who's spiritually curious but confused about what's real and what's not, I hope they pick up the book. I hope they find answers through these experts and scholars that I interview that satisfy their heart and soul. And at the end of the book, I actually have a prayer that they could pray to receive Jesus as their forgiver and their leader, to be adopted by God into his family forever. That's my goal. For a believer, I hope they read the book and I hope it deepens their faith. And also, a friend of mine uses the term, it loads their lips. In other words, it
Yeah.
prepares them to be able to defend the faith when other people challenge it. And here's the other thing I hope. I hope that they take the book after they read it. I hope they give it away. Give it away to a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, someone, family member who's spiritually curious, with the hope that God would use it in their life to bring them to faith.
Well, I pray that comes true, and I think it will. The book is Seeing the Supernatural by Lee Strobel. Thank you so much for your time, Lee, and for the great work that you continue to do for the kingdom and helping skeptics and believers alike find their way a little closer to the faith.
Well, thank you. I love what you're doing. I love your books. I love your ministry. And, you bring a certain special credibility because of your intellect, because of your experiences that I think is powerful to people who are spiritually curious. I know God's using you as a link in the chain to lead many to faith.
Thank you so much, Lee. God bless you, my friend.
You too.
Wasn't that an amazing talk? Lee Strobel, always fascinating, always makes you think, always gives you something that you didn't think of as a journalist does, looks at everything from different angles. And the book, Seeing the Supernatural, is worth your time, friend. And I'm excited to announce that we've got 3 copies of Seeing the Supernatural by Lee Strobel to give away. The great folks over at MMPR have given us 3 copies of the book. If you write in 48 hours after the episode posts, we're going to choose winners for these 3 copies. contact@drleewarren.com. Please don't send it to my personal email address. Our assistant, Lauren, is going to help us gather these emails. Contact@drleewarren is the book giveaway email address. Contact@drleewarren.com. Please send your name, your mailing address, and your zip code. It needs to be U.S. address only. It's really expensive to send books overseas, so I'm sorry the publisher and the publicity team are sending these books out at their expense. So we need to have your name, your mailing address, and your zip code if you want to be considered for one of the free books. We have 3 copies to give away. Contact@drleewarren.com. Thanks for your time and attention. As always, please like and leave a rating or review of the show wherever you get to podcasts, and please subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. If you subscribe, that increases the chances that other people will find out about the show from the algorithm that the podcast providers use. So please leave a rating, leave a review, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the show. Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter. drleewarren.substack.com is the newsletter. Please subscribe. Don't miss. Every Sunday, I give you a prescription for how you can change your mind and change your life. I hope this podcast was helpful to you, and I hope you'll take the time to check out Lee Strobel's brand new book, Seeing the Supernatural. Thank you, friend. God bless you. Don't forget, you can't change your life until you change your mind. And the good news is you can start today.